All right, can you guys hear me? Can I get a, all right, good, excellent. Awesome. Well, welcome everybody. The title of the session is Deep Dive into Compliance and Auditing at Scale. Very excited to be here with you today. My name is Andres Silva. I lead the Specialist Solutions Architects for the Cloud Operations team. We support services like Config, Audit Manager, CloudTrail, Systems Manager, and the Observability suite of products too. And I have here Karthik and Kajal. I want them to introduce themselves with the microphone.
Hi, my name is Kajal Deepak, and I lead the Audit Manager service in AWS.
Hi, I'm Karthik Vishwanath. I'm part of the AWS config team. I lead the engineering team with AWS config.
Awesome. So the goal of this session is to help you understand what you need to achieve your goals related to compliance and auditing when you're managing infrastructure in the cloud. So my commitment to you is that at the end of this session, you'll have a better understanding of which products to use, how to use them, how to integrate them to get the results you need. For that, here's the agenda that we're going to follow. We're going to talk a little bit about the challenges around compliance in the cloud. We're going to introduce you to a model that we call the 3 lines of defense, which helps and facilitates understanding how all these services work together. And then we're going to talk about managing risk, overseeing risk, and providing assurance of risk management, which is another fancy way of saying auditing, right? And then we're going to talk a little bit about how you can continue learning about these services and how to achieve compliance. So to help you understand these services, I want to tell you a story, all right? I want to introduce you to my friend John, all right? And I want to tell you a few things about John that you may find identified yourself with, right? So John was just hired as a cybersecurity engineer in charge of security, compliance, and even some portions of auditing, right? Now, he's new to the cloud, but he has a lot of experience managing traditional infrastructure. He brings a lot of knowledge in the space from the cybersecurity and compliance side of the house, but he's new to the cloud. But he's eager to learn, eager to explore what's available. And he has been tasked with implementing the compliance strategy as his organization. Now, you may identify a little bit with that, right? I think like many of us, John may be feeling a little bit of imposter syndrome. And how in the world am I going to do this? Don't worry, we're going to help you. The first thing that happens is when John starts learning about how to do things in the cloud, he starts noticing that things are different, right? There are some challenges. And I'm going to go through this very quickly. I'm not going to spend too much time on it. But as you see them, you probably have faced some of these challenges also. Things change so frequently in the cloud. The global footprint of workloads could be a challenge. The different compliance and security needs that are specific to the industry that you're on. All these are challenges that are related to compliance auditing in the cloud. So he starts learning about the different options that we have in AWS, but then he runs into another challenge. This is the challenge. And you probably are thinking, oh yeah, I feel the same way, right? We have so many features, we have so many services that we often wonder, which one do I use for what? What is, Control Tower for? How do I use Inspector? What is Config for? How do I put all this stuff together? Well, one thing that John finds out as he does a little bit more research, he finds some of the presentations that we've done on this topic, and he runs into this model of the 3 lines of defense. What is the 3 lines of defense model? It's a model that has been implemented by the Institute of Internal Auditors. And it establishes that in order to implement effective governance, risk, and compliance, you need to establish a model with 3 lines of defense. In the first line, you define the controls to mitigate risk, to identify and mitigate risk. In the second line, you implement solutions that allow you to oversee the risk. And in the third line, you implement mechanisms that allow you to provide independent assurance that you are indeed managing and overseeing risk. That's the part of auditing. So when you use this framework to make or put all our services together, it starts making sense. Services like Security Hub, and in some cases Control Tower, Backup, and Config can be used to define those controls to mitigate risk, the first line. Then services like Systems Manager, even some features of AWS Config, Security Hub, can be used to have a single pane of glass into your security posture at any given point so you can see how you're doing in terms of compliance. And then what's going to happen eventually is that an auditor is going to knock on your door and say, prove to me that you're indeed doing everything you said you're doing. And that's where services like Audit Manager, which we're going to learn a lot more about later today, and CloudTrail can help you with that. They can help you automate the process of collecting evidence and preparing everything you need for an audit. So with that knowledge, John says, you know what? I get it, right? I need to kind of get started on these 3 lines of defense. How do I get started with risk management, with the first line of defense? Let's talk a little bit about that. The first thing you should do is use Control Tower. It's the best way to get started. If you can, do it. If you need help to do it, let us know. We can help. But it's the best way to implement the controls that you need and to get started. Automate, automate, automate. Long gone are the days of trying to do things manually. Think about an EKS cluster, an auto-scaling group, and trying to track every single instance and know if it's compliant or not. Impossible. So you need to automate the detection, the changes, and react to them. Our services can help with that. Look into compliance as code. Very powerful. The same way infrastructure as code helps you when managing infrastructure, compliance as code simplifies the process of implementing compliance at scale. And take advantage of preventive and detective controls. Let's talk a little bit about that. When we say preventive, we mean things that happen before resources are created. And when we say detective, we mean, well, controls that are put in place to detect things after they have been provisioned. Of course, ideally, you want to detect things even before they are created. There are some things you could do for preventive controls in AWS. We have this category of manage. You can take advantage of service control policies in AWS organization, IAM roles and policies, and even Control Tower helps with that. Then you can also take advantage in the provisioning stage of things like CloudFormation, Service Catalog, and some partner tools like Terraform, so that you can standardize the way you provision infrastructure and make sure that it is provisioned within the limits of your compliance requirement. And then in the compliance side, you can take advantage of things like CloudFormation Guard, OPA with the Rego language, to define those controls for preventive compliance so that things are not created that are out of the requirements for your compliance regime. So that's preventive controls. Let's talk a little bit more about detective controls. And this is where AWS Config comes in, and I'm going to invite Karthik to tell you a little bit more about this service now. You have your mic? Okay.
You all can hear me okay? All right. Okay. So let me talk about AWS Config. Right? So there's 2 value propositions with AWS Config. The first is change management or configuration management, right, where we're giving you the ability to detect changes to your configuration. The second is compliance management, where using AWS Config, you can actually implement a compliance solution in your organization. So I'll dive into these 2 use cases. With AWS Config, there is also the capability for you to visualize in a single dashboard or single pane of glass what's happening across all of your accounts, either within an organization or across multiple organizations and across multiple regions. So it's giving you that visualization across regions and across accounts. Andres will talk about that more in his presentation. So let's dive into what is AWS Config. So AWS Config is the core for compliance evaluations. Right? So the first feature or service as part of AWS Config is called config recording. So this is very fundamental to for compliance management. The reason is config recording is the service that is enabling you to track every single resource configuration that is happening in your account. Right? With AWS config recording, when a resource changes, we track that and we call that a configuration item. So you probably would have noticed the word CIs or configuration items. So a configuration item basically denotes a change to your configuration resource. Right? So today with these configuration items, you can also set these up to be sent to your S3. And a very unique feature that you have with config recording is you can actually have a timeline history with config recording for your CI. So you can see how your resource has changed over time. It's giving you that timeline history. The with AWS config recording, you not only can detect changes to AWS resources, but you can also bring in resources that's outside of AWS config using this feature called custom CIs, where so now your resource could be in your on-premise or in some other cloud provider, and you can actually track those resources in AWS config recording as well. And so today, for the resources that we have in AWS, AWS config supports 52 services and across 145 resource types. And we're constantly adding more resource types that is supported as part of AWS config. So one thing that you can actually look for is like every month we'll probably be adding anywhere from 15, 30 resource types that we're going to be constantly adding to config recording. So this is foundational for compliance because you want to be able to track the resources, right? Now, built on top of config recording is config rules. What's config rules? It's basically the ability by way of which you can actually define policies in your organizations. Right? An example would be you'd have a policy of, I want all the data that is stored to be encrypted. So now you're going to map that policy to multiple config rules. So you will have one config rule to check for, is all the data stored in S3, is it encrypted by default? You would have a similar config rule for the data stored in EBS, is it encrypted by default, right? So if you look at the experience now, so let's say you create a resource type EBS volume. So when you create this resource type of EBS volume, what config recording is going to do is it's going to track, hey, a new resource has been created. We generate a CI called EBS volume, right? And now that information is passed on to config rules. And if you have a rule deployed for checking to see if the EBS volume has encryption enabled by default, you're automatically going to run that rule evaluation. And if it turns out that if your EBS volume has been set up with encryption enabled by default, then your resource is going to be marked as compliant. If the EBS volume does not have encryption enabled, now that resource is going to be marked as non-compliant. Right? With config rules, you also have the ability to take automatic action on non-compliant resources. So you can define these runbooks, which take actions when a resource is tagged as non-compliant. Right? So that's config rules where it's fundamental for implementing compliance in your organization. So there are more characteristics with config rules. First, let's look at how these rules are authored. Right? So there are two types of rules. One is AWS authored config rules, where these are out of the box rules that AWS has authored. We have over 250 plus such rules today, and we're again constantly adding more rules. So these are called managed rules. You also have custom rules because obviously AWS is not going to be able to cover every single use case for which you want to author a policy for your organization. And so that's where you have custom rules. These are Lambda functions that you can author and deploy in your environment. If you look at how these rules are executed, again, you have two types of config rules there. One is change triggered. So the example that I talked about where you create an ABS volume, right, and as soon as the resource is created, we record the resource and we're going to run rule evaluations for that resource. That's called a change triggered. So every time a resource is created or updated, you're going to run a rule evaluation. So the use case for change triggered is where you want continuous compliance. You want to be continuously monitoring compliance for your account. Then you want these change triggered rules. The second type of rule evaluations is periodic. So let's go with the same example that I talked about. You've created this EBS volume and then you've not touched it for 3 months. So you're not going to run any rule evaluations for 3 months. But your auditor might come and say, hey, I need you to run evaluations every month. So you can't give me a 3-month-old data. Right? So that's where periodic rule comes in, where you can set the frequency at which you want to run the rule evaluation, irrespective of when the resource was created or modified. At your own set frequency, you can run these rule evaluations. So that's periodic rules. So that's a quick refresher on config and config recording and rules. built on top of config rules is you have these various different AWS services. You have Security Hub, Backup, Control Tower. Um, I'll talk about few of these services. With Security Hub, you have this feature called Security Hub Controls. So as part of Security Hub standards, you have Security Hub Controls. These Security Hub Controls are nothing but config rules. Right? So under the covers, it's actually the implementation is a config rule. Similarly, for backup, with Backup Audit Manager, they have these policies where you can ensure that you have the right policies configured. Again, they're using config rules. With Control Tower, the terminology they use is Control Tower guardrails, which are again detective guardrails. There are again config rules. One call out with Security Hub Controls is when you've implemented Security Hub in your build, you'll actually see a line item for config recording, and you'll see a line item for Security Hub Controls. You won't see a line item for config rules, but it's effectively under the covers. It is a config rule that's implemented. So, well, I'll talk about Conformance Pack in a minute, but before that, it's going back to tying it back to John. So we talked about authoring config rules. Recently, we launched the ability for you to author rules using DSL CloudFormation Guard. But before I go into the details, so here I'm going to share with you a sample code prior to this launch. If you're using a Python-based rule, right, this is how the code would look like, the code that you would have to author for a Python-based rule. So the rule that we're sharing here is it's checking if the EC2 instance that's being launched is the particular type that you're looking for, right? We don't need to look at this. We're not going to dive into each line of this code. But now with CloudFormation Guard, that same code is going to be how many lines? 1, 2, 3, 4 lines. Right? This fundamentally simpler to author CloudFormation Guard DSL-based config rules. Right? So we're simplified the rule authoring process. This is for custom rules. This is if you don't have a managed rule that meets a particular requirement, you can actually use the DSL based rules to author. What makes this so simple is we've completely removed the need for you to do error handling. The reason why, when you looked at the previous code, the reason why it was so complex and you had this 3 columns of code was there was so much of error handling that you had to do. So for example, you have to detect if the CIs that you're processing, is it oversized? Is it deleted? Do you have the right permissions? Right? Now we take care of all of that. So all of that infrastructure processing is taken care by config. Right? You don't have to even do a deployment. So previously, you'd actually have to do a Lambda function. So we're abstracting that away from you. So it's like you're just passing this piece of code to us, and we take care of the infrastructure. We take care of all the error handling. Right? And the other advantage also is you previously, when you're writing a custom rule, you actually would have to also call a put evaluation API, because once you've done the computation, right, you have to call the put evaluation API to actually mark the status of the resource, right? Is it compliant or non-compliant? We will take care of that as well. So which means you don't have to know assume a role. You don't have to make a put evaluation call. So it's like all of the infrastructure is completely abstracted away. The other aspect with DSL is it's starting to go along the lines of policy as code. Right? So Andrews talked about compliance as code. So where we are, the direction that we are headed with config is we want to remove all the heavy lifting away from you, and we will do the heavy lifting. And you come and define the policies. And here with DSL, it's starting to go closer and closer where you can actually start thinking about implementing just policy as code. So that's DSL. Right? That's just in terms of the actual rule authoring experience. Let me switch gears. We'll talk about Conformance Pack. So Conformance Pack, here now I'm focusing on the deployment aspect for config rules. So if you have in your organization, if you have hundreds of rules that you're trying to deploy, right, and if you're trying to deploy this across multiple accounts, right, and if you have 100 rules, when you're deploying this over multiple accounts, you just given the volume of rules you're trying to deploy, you are automatically prone to errors, right? It's like you have to ensure that I have the right input parameters. You've done the exercise once, and I have to keep repeating it for every single time for every single rule, right? Um, Conformance pack, we're simplifying that where you create this template. It's an honorable resource. You with all your 100 rules that you want to deploy, you create this once. From that point on, you're just deploying that conformance pack. So you're remembering one artifact instead of remembering 100 artifacts. So it simplifies the deployment process. The second value proposition with conformance pack is when you're deploying a conformance pack in an AWS organization, right, across all your member accounts, with conformance packs, you can ensure that every single member account adheres to the policies or the config rules that you have deployed. The member accounts cannot change, cannot delete, or change the input parameters for the config rules. So effectively, you're creating these immutable rules. So it's a way for you to enforce that you have the policies deployed on all of the member accounts, right? So Conformance Packs integrates with AWS organization. So also with the delegated admin, so you can either deploy it from the master account or the delegated admin. With Conformance Packs, we also give you the ability to you have, from a reporting standpoint, you get an aggregated status of what is the aggregated status of the conformance pack. Today we have over 75 plus sample templates. About 50% of them are operation best practices, like operation best practice for S3, for networking, for security. We also have customized compliance. That's the other use case with Conformance Pack is customized compliance, where if you want to deploy your own customized compliance solution, right? So you can you can use the templates that we have as a starting point. Let's say you have a HIPAA compliance regime that you want to deploy. So we have a sample template with a set number of config rules that we believe is the rules applicable for HIPAA. So you can use that as a starting point, not starting from zero. And from that point on, you can then change the config rules or the input parameters to the rules to meet your specific requirements. There is also another feature with Conformance Pack called process check rules. The idea of a process check rule is for many of these compliance regimes, 30 to 50% of the requirements come from objectives that pertain to a particular resource. But you also have a large number of requirements that have nothing to do with any resource, right? So this is where process check rule comes in. For example, they might say, hey, a set of forms need to be reviewed by the auditor every month. Now, how are you going to track compliance for that? It's not a particular resource. Process check rule comes in for that, where you can now create a notion of a rule for every process or business process that you need to adhere to to meet your compliance requirements. So you basically create a rule saying check with the auditor, right? And once the auditor has actually reviewed the forms, then you can now do a put evaluation as compliant, and you actually have the evidence that the auditor has reviewed the data. So it is making it a single a place for you to track compliance for your AWS resource, as well as non-AWS resource, as well as business processes, right? So that's what we're kind of calling a use case for Conformance Pack would be customized compliance. So what did we launch yesterday with Conformance Pack? So we talked about reporting where you get an aggregated status for compliance with Conformance Packs. So let's take the example of, let's say I have 10 rules in my Conformance Pack, right? And then I have 2 resources for my Conformance Pack. Now, even if one resource is non-compliant with 1 rule or 5 rules or 10 rules, the aggregated status previously would say non-compliant, and that's it. You had no quantitative way to measure what is my compliance posture for this Conformance Pack. So yesterday we launched this feature called Compliance Score for Conformance Pack, right, where you can get quantitative data of your compliance for a Conformance Pack. So how are we measuring this data? So it's going with the same example that I gave. So I have 10 rules in my Conformance Pack, and let's say I have 2 resources that are applicable to all these 10 rules. And the way we are going to compute the compliance score is my numerator is my total number of compliant rule evaluations divided by my total number of rule evaluations. So going back to the same example, if I two resources, let's say one resource is non-compliant for all the 10 rules, and one resource is compliant, and the second resource is compliant with all the 10 rules. So I have 10 evaluations that are compliant, and I have 10 evaluations that are non-compliant. So I have a total of, so my numerator is number of compliant rule evaluations, rule resource evaluations, so that's 10. And my denominator is the total number of rule resource evaluations, that's 20. Right, so my compliance score is going to say 50%. Now, let's say you made a change. Now you went and you fixed different aspects of that particular resource. Right. So now what you've transitioned to is this: you have the same one resource that is compliant with all the 10 rules, and then the second resource is compliant with 9 rules, and it's just failing for one particular rule. So you have 19 successful rule evaluations divided by 20 total number of rule evaluations. So your compliance score then moved from 50% to 95%, right? So that's how we're computing the compliance score. So it's giving you at a glance what's the compliance posture for a conformance pack, right? Another interesting feature field. Let's see if I can point with this. So if you look at the bottom right, this little line graph here. So that is what that's showing you is the historical view for my compliance score. And where this is particularly interesting is, let's say you start deploying different changes to your in your environment, right? And you want to be able to see, hey, how is my score tracking? So you can actually measure when you make deployments, how is that, what's the impact to the compliance posture, right, for your resources in that conformance pack, right? So it's giving you that historical view, as well as it's an easy way to measure the impact of your changes. What's not shown on the screen, we also have, if you go to our dashboard, we will also stack rank these conformance packs, showing the most offending or the conformance pack with the least compliance score at the top. So this way you can automatically prioritize the C for remediation. You can prioritize the CPAC with the lowest compliance score. All right, moving on. All right, so we talked about rules. All right, so now, so John is slowly getting familiar with rules and how he can actually use rules to manage risks. Another feature we launched this year is integration with CloudWatch metrics for your configuration recording CIs. So if you want to see to ensure if you've set up your recorder appropriately, you can, if you go to the config dashboard, you can actually see a usage metrics by resource types, how your CIs are getting generated. And more interesting with that feature is also we have an error handling, we report the errors when we could not generate a CIs. Right? One of the requirements that you have for config to work is we have to have appropriate permissions to work with the respective services that's enabled with config. So if you change the permissions either accidentally or if it was a rogue actor within your account, right? We actually will programmatically we will set this metric that you can use to see, okay, some changes happened to your config recorder that is not allowing config to record these CIs. So you can proactively take action. It's not silently, things are not being dropped on the floor. So it's more another a safety mechanism for you just to manage the risks. All right. So just to kind of summarize what we talked about rules and conformance packs. There's one last point that I want to call out, which comes out often, is security of standards versus conformance pack. When do I use standards versus conformance pack? Security of standards is a managed service. So when you want to have a managed solution for your compliance regime, you use Security Hub. But with conformance pack it's a do-it-yourself, or if you have to customize the solution and you're not happy with what's offered, or if your environment is very specific, you want to customize the compliance offering, then you can use conformance pack. So if I'm John, I realize that I have to really learn about config. Now let me hand it back to Andreas.
All right. Good. Can you hear me now? Okay, good. All right, so thank you, Karthik. So what is evident, as you can see, is we need to become familiar with config. Config is foundational to defining those controls, to mitigate the risk. That's going to be in the first line of defense. There's a couple of other components that are important in that first line of defense. I'm not going to spend too much time on them, but I encourage you to learn more about Systems Manager, and specifically these 4 features that you see at the bottom: Quick Setup, Automation, Run Command, and Inventory Patch Manager. They're part of that first line of defense and allow you to define those controls and mitigate risk. And also, an important part is automation that allows you to remediate a non-compliant resource. So super powerful. The other thing that we should talk about is CloudTrail. How many people are familiar with CloudTrail? That's a dumb question, right? we know CloudTrail very well. One thing that I'm very excited about is we recently released CloudTrail Lake. Traditionally, we have CloudTrail has delivered the files for your auditing with all your auditing events to an S3 bucket, and then customers are responsible for taking the files that have been delivered there and doing analysis on them. CloudTrail Lake is a fully managed, immutable platform where we take the data. It's not dependent on the S3 data. You can actually turn off the S3 data if you want. We take the data, we ETL the data for you, we optimize it for search, and you have a very easy on-the-console experience where you can do search and querying of your data. So I'm super excited, and hopefully I'll have a couple minutes to show you a demo of it later on the presentation. But it's super important also when you are on that first line of defense. Okay, so we talked about the first line. We spent quite a bit of time there because it's foundational, it's important. Let's talk about the second line of defense. John quickly realizes, okay, so I need to get started with overseeing risk. What are some of the services that I can use to oversee risk for that second line of defense? Let's talk about that. So interestingly enough, config has some features that fall into that second line of defense. There's a very powerful feature called aggregators that takes all that data that is collected for resource tracking when config is enabled, and also the compliance state, if it's compliant or non-compliant, across all your accounts and across all your regions, and centralizes it, puts it in a single place that you can query very easily or that you can navigate through the dashboard. This is a very powerful and effective way of overseeing where you're at in terms of compliance from a single location. The other thing you should know about is Security Hub. Karthik explained a little bit about it, but it's super important for that second line of defense of overseeing risk. All right, good deal. So I know how to manage risk and define my controls. I know how to oversee risk. How do I get ready for my audit? So for this, I want to invite Kajal to tell you a little bit about Audit Manager.
Hi. Audit Manager is a service that was launched about 18 months ago at reInvent of 2020. And this service was launched in response to this last problem that John has. John now needs to work with his GRC team to make sure that all the work that has been done can be translated into security assurance and reporting. That can be a challenge for a lot of customers. And the reason is that these teams often live in information silos. The GRC team is having to work very manually with the IT team in order to get the data they need, because the mappings they need to be able to demonstrate to regulatory compliance regimes require that translation layer. Audit Manager solves that problem. So let me talk a little bit about what the service does. Audit Manager comes with pre-built data mappings. So we have 26 frameworks and always increasing. For example, PCI and HIPAA, et cetera. And these frameworks are mapped to data sources. So all of the work that John has done in setting up the config rules and the recordings and all the CloudTrail data that is getting collected, Audit Manager goes and takes that data and automatically maps it to the controls that the GRC team is trying to fulfill as a part of their regulatory compliance. In some ways, Audit Manager is similar to Security Hub in the sense that it's acting as a single pane of glass. And just like Security Hub is fetching data from underlying services, Audit Manager is fetching data from underlying services to show the compliance officer the views that they need to see. So what Audit Manager does is, in order to continuously audit your AWS usage, you have to start with a framework. Like I said, there are pre-built frameworks which are available in Audit Manager that make it very easy to get started. It's a very easy click-through flow. Once you have selected the framework, you have to define the scope of assessment. So you will want to choose the accounts for which you want to gather data. The service uses a service-linked role to be able to collect that data on the customer's behalf. And it's also integrated with organizations. So you can use all of the accounts which might be connected to your organization's account. And you can select the accounts in scope, the services in scope, and who are the folks that you want to give permission to for the data that will be gathered in the assessments. Once you have all of that defined, you go ahead and activate the assessment. And now the service will automatically go and start collecting data on your behalf. So the service will make API calls at the frequency at which you want. The service will go collect data from config rules and Security Hub, as well as CloudTrail usage data will show up. These are automated data sources. And then eventually, the GRC person can generate an assessment report. So they can review the evidence, they can select the evidence that they want to be able to share, either with the executives or auditors, and they can download that into an assessment report. All evidence is time-stamped and comes with checksums, so it's very clear that it's immutable and has not been tampered with. So that's kind of like what the Audit Manager service will do. In terms of data sources, there are 5 data sources. As I mentioned, we use activity logs from CloudTrail. We use config, including custom config rules. So if there are custom controls that the GRC person wants to define, and there are corresponding custom config rules which are being utilized, they can be mapped to each other and reported. We pull data from Security Hub, compliance checks, and we make API calls to get some of the resource configuration data. In addition, the customer can also use manual upload. So there is some evidence that will always be required to be managed manually. For example, what are my policies? What is the actual statement? Or that I am sharing this information with my board of directors, meeting minutes. So these are all audit requirements that the GRC person needs to manage holistically. An Audit Manager ensures that can be done. The manual upload can also be used to ingest on-prem data into Audit Manager, or potentially multi-cloud data, because it's an API that allows for batch upload. So if customers want, they can use the Audit Manager frameworks as a complete data repository across their environment. Here is a list of some of the major frameworks that Audit Manager already supports. As I mentioned, these come in pre-built. In other words, you will have a detailed definition of all the controls that these frameworks are requiring, along with exactly what are the data sources that should be mapped to evidence in order to be able to satisfy the control. And there is also the possibility of being able to define your own custom controls. So in several cases, customers might want to modify a requirement and make it more stringent, or they might want to add governance controls. An Audit Manager will allow them to essentially use it as a reporting engine that can be mapped to AWS usage data sources. There's a whole library that you can get with an Audit Manager. I also wanted to quickly show you what does it look like for the GRC person. So once you start to get into this continuous collection of evidence, it can actually be a pretty overwhelming experience. So how do you navigate that? So Audit Managers helps the GRC officer navigate it easily by presenting a dashboard, which allows them to quickly see what the non-compliant evidence looks like so that they can dive into it. And they can look at this with specific assessment. So you can see how many assessments are running right now. So a customer might be simultaneously collecting data for PCI and SOC 2 or GLBA or multiple compliances at the same time. And they will be able to do this deep dive from the dashboard for each specific assessment. This is just to give you a view of what the evidence actually looks like and how it's organized. So depending on the specific compliance regime that you have chosen, it'll be organized into the control sets which are defined and the actual controls, and you will be able to see how much evidence has been collected. So that's how John is going to meet the requirement of his GRC partners. And this is a piece that is the last mile, but not to be underestimated, because organizations spent a lot of money and time just managing that talk across the information silos. And that's what Audit Manager is here to help you with. With that, I'll pass it back to.
All right, excellent. No? Okay. See? Oh, yeah? All right, all right. I was just testing you. You're still with me. Excellent. Yeah, so we're very excited about Audit Manager, as Kajal was explaining. Great way to simplify evidence collection. So definitely look into it and try to learn more about it. What I want to do now is give you a demo. You want to see it in action, and we'll try to deliver here. Let's see, hopefully you know how demos are, right? Like, they work until you have to do them live. We're not going to have time for questions on stage, but we'll be here, and we'll be happy to chat with you, okay? Very good. Yeah, we're doing good on time. Okay, so let me do a couple of things here to get my demo ready. And switch here. No, that's not it. Oh yeah, that's it. What happens is that's what I have open in my laptop. Very good. Okay, so we talked about a lot of things. I'm not going to demo all of them because we wouldn't have time. It would probably take like 12 hours. But I want to show you some of the new things that we talked about today. I want to take you through the journey of defining a control and all the way to collecting the evidence for it. So the first step is defining a control, right? So something that you want to validate on your environment. And we do that through config rules, right? Now, traditionally, we've had managed rules, custom rules, backed by Lambda functions. I want to show you how the new DSL rules work, and they use CloudFormation Guard. So it's super easy to deploy one. You go here and you click Add Rule in the console. And now you're going to see there's 3 options. And the last option on the right is Create Custom Rule using Guard. So you select that one. Now here, you provide a name for the rule. You can provide, some description here that you want. Any information that is helpful to identify what's tracking, what are you validating on it. As you can see here, we have the option of Guard 2.xx, which is what we currently support. You have the option also of enabling logs, so you can troubleshoot if something is not working properly with the rule. And now in the rule content is where you're going to define what is going to be evaluated. And I have a good example here. This rule that you see here, let me see, yep. Okay, so this rule that you see here, it's a rule, I'm going to paste it in here and then explain it. So basically, we use in the CloudFormation Guard syntax, and it's very well documented, it's open source. We give the rule a name, desirable volume IOPS. We then say when configuration volume type, and we're passing a parameters. This is something actually pretty cool that you can do with DSL rules. You can pass parameters into the rules, and I'm going to show you how you add that later. This is the name of the parameter that we've chosen. And it's validating if the IOPS property and the configuration of that resource is between these 2 values, 3,000 or 4,000, right? It's a very simple rule. But you can see, like Karthik was saying, if you had to express this in code and do all the error checking, it would have been a lot, right? Super simple here. So then I'll go here and I say, okay, what type of resources do I want to check with this rule? I want to check volumes, right? EC2 volume. Right? Now, volume. There we go. Now it worked. And here's where I would pass my parameter. Right? And I would say GP3. I want to only validate that for GP3 volumes. Right? So this is kind of interesting now because we have more flexibility into checking volume IOPS for a specific volume type. You can add even more criteria to the rule. So if you wanted to check on the same rule, if the same volume was encrypted, you can do it with one rule, all in one shot. So you can add multiple criteria just by editing the DSL on the rule. Now we have our rule all set up. It's a review here, and we add the rule. And as soon as we add the rule, it's going to trigger a reevaluation of all the resource types EC2 volume. And in a couple of minutes, I will have the state of those resources according to that rule. So we just define a rule for that. I can attach a remediation action to it if I wanted to that uses automation on the back end. I want to show you real quick that you can also do this. You can also do this with CloudFormation. I'm not sure how clear that is on the screen. Let me check, make sure that you can see it. This is an example of how you can define that DSL rule in CloudFormation. This is super impactful because traditionally with custom rules, you had to create the Lambda, you had to deploy the Lambda centrally, you had to reference the Lambda to that account from all accounts so that it could execute with a role that could be assumed. Now, you just express the syntax of the DSL rule and you can deploy across all your accounts and regions. And all the code that you need is right in there. So super powerful way of defining those controls. So what happens is once you have your control defined, you're going to be able now to use that for your evidence collection. So I want to take you real quick to Audit Manager. Let's go to Audit Manager. And I don't have the time to do a full-blown demo of Audit Manager, but I want to show you how you define evidence collection control in Audit Manager to pull that information of that rule that we just created into Audit Manager. So this is the way the Audit Manager console looks like. Kajal talked about the dashboard and all the features. I'm not going to go over that again. But at the foundation of Audit Manager is a control. A control is a validation that you make of a specific control, right? Like, are my volumes encrypted? Or it's, they're automated, as she explained, and manual controls. So let's go to the control library, and let's go and create a custom control. And what we're going to do, we're going to give it a description just to test. You can include testing information that will help the person that is reviewing that control once the assessment is deployed to know how to validate or test that control and make sure that it has the right data. You can add tags also. And this is where we specify the data source. Where is the data for evidence collection for that control coming from? You can have multiple data sources, and the data source can be either manual or it can be automatic. So we're going to do custom rule. It's going to be automated, and the source, as you can see, we could do API calls, we could do CloudTrail, we could do config, security hub. So we're going to do config, and now I have the option of selecting either a managed rule or a custom rule. And I'm going to go ahead and find that rule, demo 123, remember that we just deployed. It's now showing up there. That's going to be the rule that I'm going to use to collect evidence. And I'm going to give it a title, demo 123. And I am going to create my custom control. Now, this doesn't do really anything. It just defines the control. It's like, okay, this is how this data is collected. That control has to become part of a framework. We provide a number of frameworks that you can customize. Now, I can take a PCI, a HIPAA framework, and add this custom control to that as part of the framework. Now, I'm customizing and expanding the power of my framework. Once I have that framework deployed, once I have the framework, I can deploy that framework, and that framework becomes an assessment. The process of creating an assessment, you say, okay, this is the framework that I want to use. These are the accounts that I want to assess, and these are the services that I want to assess as part of this assessment. Once you do that, Audit Manager is going to start collecting the evidence automatically for you. And I have a couple of assessments deployed here. I have a very simple assessment here. I think I have a better one here. So let me show it to you real quick in this account. But basically, you will now have, this is the dashboard, as you can see. And I have I have a SOC 2 assessment here. And now I can go into the specific assessment. And I can start reviewing my controls, including those custom controls that I've added. One of the things that is cool about Audit Manager is that you can also use it with CloudTrail, right? And speaking about CloudTrail, I want to show you a little bit of CloudTrail Lake because I talked about it briefly, and we're very excited about it. So let me show you how this powerful service works. So I'm going to go to the CloudTrail console, and then I'll come back to Audit Manager to see how we can put this together. So now under the CloudTrail console, you will see that there's a Lake section on the left here. And the first thing you need to do in order to use Lake is create an event data store. So if you go to your account, you're not collecting any evidence because you have to actually tell us that you want to use the service, right? And you do that by creating an event data store. It's super simple. You come here, you click here, you specify a name, and you say if you want the current region only or all accounts. And then you choose either management events or data events, right? And for data events, we have S3, Dynamo events, all those types of events. And you can also do, you can filter the events using specific criteria with advanced event selectors if you like to do that. Once you create your event data store, as you can see here, I have a couple of them here. I have one that is an organizational one, and I have one for the single account. Now you can start querying, right? And I have a query here, as you can see. What this query does is it gives me, and it's using SQL syntax, very familiar SQL syntax. I love SQL, super easy, right? I'm pulling all these fields. I'm saying from the EDS ID or Event Data Store ID, and then I'm setting up some criteria. So what this query is looking for is any events that are showing unauthorized access. So that shows that somebody's trying to access something that they're not supposed to. And I have some events that I've intentionally created here for that. And I'm going to run the query, and then it's going to tell me that it has failed because, see, this is how demos work, right? But I have the query here, and I think that's what's happening. So let me run it again and replace the EDS here, paste it. And now it's running, as you can see here in the status. And it returned 41 records. I searched from 24-hour period, from yesterday, not 24, less than 24 hours, from yesterday to this point. And it found 41 records. I can go to query results here, and I can see there's somebody trying to do describe tags, and they don't have access, right? So this is important information when you're auditing your environment or when you're doing some forensic investigation of an incident from an operational perspective. Super powerful information that you can use. Now, this is interesting because a lot of the auditing that you do and a lot of the evidence that is needed for auditing is going to come from CloudTrail. And Audit Manager works in connection with CloudTrail to do that also. So you can come to Audit Manager here. I can go to my control library. I can create a custom control using CloudTrail demo. I'm just going to give it a name. I'm not going to add any of the testing information. And I'm going to call this from CloudTrail. And then I want to show you briefly how it works. It's an automated, but now I'm going to choose CloudTrail. And when I click here, I'm going to see all the events that I can evaluate from CloudTrail. I can choose the specific event that I'm looking for. I can put the criteria, and now I'm collecting evidence directly from CloudTrail that I can use in my Audit Manager assessment. So that's how powerful that is. I want to show you a couple of more things related to config, specifically the things that Karthik mentioned in his presentation. I need to go back here and go to config. So the first thing I want to show you is compliance score. We talked about compliance score, and it's calculated with conformance packs, and it gives you that score based on the results of the evaluation. If you go to the console, and if you have conformance packs deployed, you will automatically now see this dashboard here with the compliance score for the different conformance packs that you have deployed. As you can see here, I have 3 conformance packs. And if I go into one of them, 53%, I can get the details. And I don't have history here because I deployed them earlier today, so I didn't have enough time to collect history. So, but if I hadn't deployed, for quite a period of time, I would see the compliance score. Actually, the real reason I think why I don't have the history is because this was just released, and I don't have enough time running it to see it. But here's where you will see that history of the compliance score, and down here you will see all the rules. The other thing that I want to show you briefly that we're excited about is the config metrics. And if you go to the main console here, you can see them here in this area. Let me see if I can kind of move this around. Let's see if we can show you more data here. So there's a couple of ones that come up in the console right there. Configuration items recorded. As you can see, I don't have a lot of activity in this account, so I have some dots there. This is a demo account that is, if it was a real account where you have resources spinning up and spinning down all the time, you will see more meaningful data here. But that's what it shows you. And this one here is actually pretty cool. This is the one that Karthik was mentioning, where you have insufficient data. And if there was any errors, because you don't have the right permissions, you would see the errors piling up there in that other graph. Now, what you can do is, let me see how much time I have. Okay, 3 minutes. You can actually go to CloudWatch now and look in the metrics, and you're going to see a new category that is called AWS config. No, that's not it. Where are all my metrics? That's not what I want to see. Hold on one second. Let me try another account. I think that's messed up. Hopefully I won't run out of time. Bear with me. I promise this is going to be good. Oh, I still have 3 minutes, so I'm good. Not sure why that wasn't working there. Okay, so here are all the metrics. And if you look at all the categories of the metrics that we include, you're going to see now that we have here one for AWS config. Let me see if I can find it. Billing config, right here. Okay? So what you can do, now we have conformance by resource type, failure metrics. So you can actually come here and map these metrics and create your own dashboards, right? So that's pretty cool. You don't have to go by what we have on the dashboard, but you can create your own dashboards. You can extend the power of CloudWatch and create alarms so that you're getting errors in that specific metric. You can trigger an alarm and have notify you that something is wrong with the permission so you can address it and fix it. So this is super powerful to make sure that config is recording all the data that you need for your compliance. But yeah, that's it. Let me just wrap it up real quick. I think I have, 2 minutes. That's perfect. What happened there? Demo? Okay. So some key takeaways from this presentation. Remember the 3 lines model that we shared with you. Remember how all the services fit within that 3-line model. That is going to help you understand how to use our services. Number 2 is AWS config is core to compliance. So it's good to get familiar with that service and understand and take benefit of all the features. And we have so many options for compliance. We talked about Security Hub. We talked a good amount about Audit Manager and all the powerful features that it has to help you collect evidence. So try to learn more about all that. Here are some things you can scan for additional resources. There is a couple of repos that we have. One with a solution that incorporates the 3 lines of defense. That's the first one on the left. And on the right, we have our sample repo of cloud operations where we have samples around Systems Manager, config, and many other services. So take a picture, scan them, take advantage of them. And that's it. Thank you very much. Please fill out the survey, and we can go out there and answer any questions. Thank you very much.